What if Poland was a superpower? Whatifalthist. There we go. Warsaw. This is so strange. Warsaw is written in English, but all the other cities are written in Polish. Warsaw, and this Grójec, Łódź, Radom. It should be Warszawa. What is this weird inconsistency? It makes me feel strange. I think I'm gonna make the video slightly louder. Okay. I feel ready. I feel ready to relax. Don't worry about anything and just comment on some history based on what I know. And at least in this topic, imps. An imp is a little creature, you know? An imp is a little cute creature. We can look, I'm gonna show you. Imp. This is an imp. See? Little demon spawns because she's demon mama, right? So imps are like little demon spawns. It's here. Imp, a small mischievous devil or sprite. Yeah. It's like on brand. My little imps because she's demon mama and she, right? We're in hell. We're fighting the little imps of demon mama right now. But demon mama's our friend, so it's okay. She forgives, I'm sure. Okay. So we're gonna, because I'm fairly confident about being. Do you know what if alt history? Are you familiar with this creator or not at all? Yeah. And I'm feeling when it comes to the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, because I've been reading a lot on it lately, I'm feeling very confident on when it comes to the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, to the point when the title is incorrect. It should not be what if Poland was a superpower. I'm pretty sure he's on the right but prepares not to be. Okay. He's a right winger but pretends not to be. Okay, I understand. Yeah, makes sense. Most of them do. The so-called centrists. Like the proper title should be What if the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth was a superpower? Oh, we can watch it after this video. Are you interested in us viewing it after this video? I'm actually really interested in watching this video. It's 16 minutes 59 seconds. If boring things happen, we can skip around, I know what my main complaint with this video is, and it's that the whole premise is incorrect. Poland is not the same as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It's a common mistake, but I still really dislike it when people make the mistake. That's a mistake that even Polish people make, and Lithuania really does not like it when Poland makes this mistake. And because I'm not a blind nationalist, I rather learn about, history as it actually happened. I like to sort of engage in real history, so I don't really care for the self-congratulatory nationalistic narrative that was forced into history in retrospective. Okay, let's see.
Very particular historical reputation.
Okay.
In recent history, Poland has been repeatedly conquered, partitioned, and divided without end by its...
Wrong. Right off the bat, this is incorrect. Wow. Oh my gosh. Like, this is incorrect. Like, yeah, sure, the second Commonwealth was Polish, but it, technically speaking, was not really partitioned. It was occupied during the war, which is not the same as it being partitioned.
Neighbors. Poland is synonymous with a battleground and is seen mostly as a victim to the greater powers around it. This wasn't always the case. The Poles were once, from the 15th to 17th centuries, one of the greatest powers in Europe. Poland controlled a huge swath of Eastern Europe, but the Poles...
See, this is incorrect. This is a very bad nationalistic narrative. This is what happens when the nation states arose, you know. When the nation states were created, history itself was changed to fit the nation state narrative. And so, and actually, even more interestingly, the history was written through the vicious countries that have partitioned the Commonwealth. So, Poland, instead of it being a union between the Kingdom of Poland and the Great Duchy of Lithuania, it became suddenly Poland controlling a big land of part of Eastern Europe, which was incorrect. Okay? So right off the bat, it was the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, not Poland.
Poles even
It even has here.
occupying Moscow. Poland was a center of wealth, democracy, and culture. However,
Not Poland, the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth.
this passed away and Poland was eventually partitioned and conquered by its neighbors.
The Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth was partitioned. Poland was just a part of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. Like, you can really see that this is a right-winger because he really buys into the whole nationalistic narrative, okay, of it being Poland. It really shows the nationalism.
What if this never occurred? What if Poland remained one of the most powerful countries in Europe? How would this have affected the rest of history? Wars, borders, culture, and demographics? That is the question of this alternate history.
I can tell you one thing. One thing that definitely would not have happened, because you have to remember, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had a very, very specific political system that was different from its neighbors. And also, unlike what the alt history person wants to say, it was not Poland, it was multicultural, multi-ethnical, and multi-religious. It was a union based on the participation as citizens in the Commonwealth. So, there's a high probability, first of all, that if the Commonwealth was still here, Israel would never have, been created after World War II. That's a given, because probably the Holocaust would not have happened. And also, another thing is that there is a high probability that the nation state would not form within the Commonwealth, that it would have remained a composite state as opposed to a nation state. So that it would be double the case that there would be no quote-unquote Poland, there would be the Commonwealth. But let's continue. Because if the Commonwealth was to be a superpower, it could not be Poland, because otherwise it would break apart into the small nation states and we would just end up with what we have now. Do you understand? So we will see how this person's right-wing views can sort of, how he will try to deal with the fact that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was not a nation state and that it was a composite state. And let's see how he deals with it, because this is a dilemma for him to narrate us through.
Before we start, like Poland, our digital lives are surrounded by sharks trying to prey on us. Surprisingly, a disproportionate amount do come from Russia. However, unlike what
Okay.
Poland did, you can take action to securely protect yourself. This is where NordVPN comes in. They sell VPNs that can reroute your location to over 60 countries, including Thailand, Albania, and Costa Rica. Recommended
And
by
of course, the
TCMag and
whole
VPN Mentor, they have
it
very
was
fast
very
servers to
complicated.
protect your
The
data, especially in public
Commonwealth
locations
being
where they're most
partitioned,
threatened in
it was
areas like
not as easy
airports and
as just not
cafes. With
securing
double
your
encryption, you're
borders.
sure to be
It
secure.
was far more
It works on
complicated.
most operating systems like Mac OS,
It had
Linux,
to
and
do with the Commonwealth's sort of being crippled politically from the inside. And this is a whole very complicated topic of the liberum veto, of many other laws. He's probably gonna talk about it. So when he mentions these things, like, I'm just wondering what are the circumstances in which he sees the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth not being partitioned, because it was a very complicated situation that did not happen overnight. It happened through as a result of hundreds of years. And of course, the bad treatment of the Zaporozhian Cossacks.
Windows. Check out NordVPN for your like this.
Okay, back to the video. I want to see.
When I run this show or try to predict geopolitics in general, there are a couple metrics I look out for.
Of course, you need to understand that the geopolitics of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth era were totally different than the geopolitics of today. So you definitely cannot use today's metrics to judge how a country would do. That would be a huge mistake.
Or whether a country will be successful. A representative or at least fair government, a market economy that encourages people to work hard, a strong military, good geography,
A
etc.
market economy, huh? The problem with this right off the bat is that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a country that was not, I'm not sure if this is common knowledge, but the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was actually not moving towards capitalism. It was not. It became in a sort of a specific kind of feudalism in which there was no... Hello, Moho. Hello, hello. We're discussing a video by Alternative History about my favorite topic, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, while, of course, playing some Doom. And I'm explaining that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth never actually moved towards capitalism. It remained in a strange state of feudalism in which there was no really... Okay, so I should start by saying that the main people in charge of the Commonwealth were the nobles. And the nobles did not really do things because of the profit motive. They basically just tried to earn money in order to maintain their noble lifestyles. That was the main goal. The goal was not profit. The goal was maintaining of lifestyle. So basically, the Commonwealth was not really a capitalistic country.
The really frustrating thing is that early modern Poland fulfilled most of almost any metric that you could ask for a successful society. If you ignored one...
Also, early modern Poland was not Poland at all. It was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I will keep repeating it because I really, really dislike the misconception that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is the same as just Poland. Super fertile soil, that was due to the Ukrainian part of the Commonwealth. Market economy, not exactly. This is a much more complicated issue. I should make a drinking game out of it, but I don't really have any alcohol with me. It would be interesting to make a drinking game out of it while discussing an artist video. Well, it would be very interesting to make a drinking game out of it. I would have to prepare some alcohol. But you know what? I hear your suggestion, and for any future video about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, I will prepare a bingo card and I will prepare some alcohol for a drinking game. Representative Republic. This is also a bit more complicated because the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth was a nobles' republic. So de facto, the nobles were basically the people that had the rights to vote, etc. Actually, I think more than about 30% of the whole population were nobles or something like that. Skilled military establishment, tolerant pluralist system, that's actually correct. Temperate climate, okay. Strong intellectual culture is very complicated as well. But I will say that the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth has created the first Ministry of Education in the world. So in this case, that's actually fairly correct to say. But let's see. But this is again, do you see this flag? Red, white, red flag representing the union between the Kingdom of Poland and the Great Duchy of Lithuania. Yeah, this flag is really nice. I like it as well. And I want to tell you something even more interesting. Even the modern day red, white and red flag of Poland, even the modern day white and red flag of Poland represents the union of Poland and Lithuania a little bit in its colors. This is a little bit of trivia that I think even most of Polish people do not know.
Poland seemed to have been destined for superpower status. Poland was a democracy, and with a voter registration of 7%, was the most democratic European state until the 1830s.
Let me see.
If you ignored one major variable, Poland seemed to have been destined for superpower status. Poland was a democracy, and with a...
The Commonwealth was not a democracy. The Commonwealth was a mixed monarchy. So basically, yeah. I think actually there were more. This is a pretty conservative estimate, pun intended, because this person is supposedly a conservative. But the thing is that the Commonwealth was a mixed monarchy. The nobles were in charge of the country, yes, and from the nobles they elected a king. At least the History Matters video mentioned Lithuania. He still hasn't, because he's treating the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth as just Poland. That is why. So the system worked like this. I will simplify it as much as I can for the purpose of answering to this video. The nobles were in charge, and there was this great slogan, all of the land is ruled by the nobles. And from within the nobles, in a sort of a democratic style, the nobles would elect a king. The voting requirement was that you were a noble. And being a noble was a bit complicated also. I keep saying complicated, but there were nobles that were actually very, very poor in the Commonwealth. There existed nobles. And there was a very proud slogan within the Commonwealth that the poorest noble is just as powerful as the most rich noble, because they have all equal rights within the law. And within that system, they did democratically elect a king, but the king did not have as much power as in other kingdoms. Okay? The king was able to, he was the leader of the army, he could choose some offices. I think they had guns by the end of the Commonwealth's lifespan. And of course, the famous saying was, the king reigns but does not rule, which means that the king did not rule over his subjects of the Commonwealth. And of course, the king had to sign a contract with the nobles of the things that he would fulfill as the king and swear loyalty to the Commonwealth. And the contract was such that if the king would not fulfill the contract, the nobles could just replace the king, basically. That was the deal. Okay? That was the deal. That should the king not fulfill his duties, the nobles would be able to replace him and elect a new one.
Voter registration of 7% was the most democratic European state until the 1830s.
See? European state. This is a mistake because nation states were not a thing during the Commonwealth. This is also a big mistake if he is going to try to frame the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth as a nation state.
The parliament, or Sejm, was so powerful the monarch could be deposed at will, and the Poles had a powerfully strong sense of personal liberty and freedom. In an age of...
This is a mistake as well. The king could not be deposed because the Sejm was so powerful. The king could be deposed because the nobles in general were so powerful. You see, this is how the system was made, that the more nobles were in charge of the country and the king reigned but did not rule. No, actually the king could just be deposed. They did not have to kill him because the king did not have that much power to begin with, do you see? They could very well just depose him, get rid of him, chase him away, and elect a new one. They did not really have the need to kill him. That's the thing.
Religious war and oppression, Poland was a haven of tolerance for any group, whether Muslim, pagan, Jewish, Orthodox, or Protestant.
This is correct. This is
Meanwhile,
correct.
Poland had a fairly well-developed capitalist economy, with large
That is totally incorrect. This one is totally incorrect. I am very confident. I'm not going to give you figures. I'm not going to give you like things on top of my head. But claiming that the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth had a very well-developed capitalist economy is totally incorrect. Not only is this incorrect, the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth never went towards capitalism within its lifetime. I don't think anarchists understand what makes capitalism capitalism, because the nobles sold things and even that became less profitable as time went by. They did sell things to the rest of Europe, but they did not sell it to create profit. This is a very crucial thing. They made money in order to just be able to keep their lifestyles. There was no thriving capitalism within the Commonwealth. This is blatantly incorrect. Many really good books actually describe this in detail.
revenues gained from agriculture and mining. Poland was a center of culture.
This is very incorrect. Actually, the Commonwealth was treated by the rest of Europe as being, how to say it, very inadequate economically, you know, that the Commonwealth could be cheated out of money very easily because it was considered to be inept economically. So this is definitely incorrect that it had a booming capitalism
Polish
economy.
writers famous and Polish universities renowned.
Very incorrect.
So what was Poland's one major flaw? It was that political, economic...
Well, it wasn't Poland. That was its first, thing that you should,
and social power was dominated by the Szlachta, who were Poland's noble class, who were about...
Okay, this is ridiculous. This is really ridiculous. Now this is the first time in this video when the maker of this video just outright trips all over himself, because before in the video he said that the Commonwealth is great because it has 7%, actually it's probably more, of democratic representation. Do you remember that part of the video when he said that? 7% of people could vote, democracy, amazing. But Szlachta means nobles in Polish. Those people that made the Commonwealth democratic in the first place were the people that he's claiming to be the big weakness of the Commonwealth. So which is it? Were they the biggest weakness of the Commonwealth, or were they great and making democracy? You have to choose one. You cannot have both.
About 7% of the Polish population.
See? He even says it here, 7% of the Polish. So he does admit that it's the thing that,
Those who were able to vote. Poland had a strange situation, which during the High Middle Ages, when feudalism thrived in Western Europe, in Poland, the average farmer was free. However,
No! What?
feudalism,
This is so... No! The average farmer was free? No, 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 no. What? Okay, I will tell you this now. I will tell you this now because I'm getting angry and agitated by this video. I have to listen to this again, okay? There is a lot to unpack here. I will just tell you this. This person has no idea about the history of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth and is making this video basically without knowing anything. And I will explain to you why in a second, okay? Let's listen to this.
which during the High Middle Ages, when feudalism thrived in Western Europe, in Poland, the average farmer was free. However, as Europe left feudalism and grew into a capitalist society with...
Well, maybe, okay, I will give him a chance. Maybe I'm jumping the gun. Maybe he will just say what I want to say now. I will give him a chance, okay? I will not jump the gun. Maybe I'm about to say something silly here.
Massive cities, they needed a greater food supply. This supply came from lightly populated Poland, where the nobility...
Not Poland, Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Suddenly usurped the peasantry to supply Western Europe with grain. The serfs had to work for their lord more than 50 days a year unpaid, and were de facto forbidden from leaving their lands and moving to the city. This strangled Poland's urbanization, while the rest of Europe surged ahead. The Szlachta were also forbidden to get involved in trade, and since they were the main ones with income, that ground manufacturing and other developed industries down.
So basically, the peasants were not free at all. They were under a thing called pańszczyzna, which means they were basically tied to their land and had to work under the nobles that basically owned them. Like saying that the average peasant was free in the Commonwealth is totally not true. Not only were the peasants not free, they were treated as less than human. They were actually magical quacks that tried to do some weird race realism thing, but with peasants, by claiming that the brain of a peasant is of the shape of a working tool. Yes, that's a real thing. The doctors of the Commonwealth seriously claimed that an average peasant's brain is of the shape of the working tool that he uses. This is some weird trivia that I'm sharing with you about, bigotry in the Commonwealth. Classism and bigotry.
The other main variable was that when the Polish Jagiellon dynasty continually gave power to the nobility, thus weakening their own power. This is good in certain circumstances like happened in England, but in Poland, in which the church and towns weren't counterbalancing forces, resulted in the nobility gaining control of society in England. There's this myth that Poland grew so weak since they had a provision in the Sejm in which a single voter could veto a policy.
It's not a myth.
This actually wasn't a big issue until Poland was already...
It's not a myth, and it was a huge issue. So no, you don't know what you're talking about. This was a huge issue. It's not a myth. I'm sorry to say.
Already seriously in decline. It came from medieval philosophy that demanded the opinions of every nobleman be honored, but in all...
Actually, this is a pretty interesting issue because there was a certain balance of the inner circle. I'm gonna make it very simplified, okay? there was a balance of the so-called inner circle and the so-called outer circle. And the other circle was made out of the weaker nobles, okay? And the inner circle was made of the stronger group of nobles. And since the democracy within the nobility was supposed to be absolute, they made up a law that allowed a single noble to stop voting on new law, by saying, I forbid. And then the voting would be ended and the nobles would disperse to their homes. This is basically the simplified version of how the so-called liberum veto law came to be.
Practicality, whenever a majority of the Sejm greater than 2/3 voted on an issue, the others would be ignored. The law was only followed to the letter when Poland had already become a Russian puppet in the 18th century, and the Russians forced them to in order to make Poland as weak as possible. The easiest way to make this timeline happen is that the Jagiellonian monarchy is able to maintain more power against the nobility while allying with the towns and briefly with the Polish church against the nobility, thus allowing Poland to develop into a more politically pluralistic society.
Of course, this is still not as simple because that would not change much if the Zaporozhian Cossacks would be not treated well and not be invited into being nobles. They would still do the Cossack uprisings, and that would still basically cripple the country. So the result would still be the same at the end of the day if that would not be stopped in any way. You see?
The Sejm still exists, but it represents interests beside the Szlachta. All things considered, this timeline isn't that far-fetched. In the mid-18th century, when Poland ushered in some of the reforms I mentioned, they saw the start of industrialization and a cultural and intellectual renaissance.
In the 18th century, that was far too late. Under the king.
The effects of this timeline take some time to fully work out. Remember, Poland was a great power, since the positive effects of the Polish system outweigh
the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth at the beginning, by the end of the 17th century, was not really a superpower anymore.
The negative for centuries, and it's sort of hard to make a hard and fast line between the two. A change that would occur for certain would be the greater wealth and productivity of Poland. There are two ways to structure a frontier society, which early modern Poland certainly was. One can either deal with the lack of people and infrastructure by falling back on freedom or servitude. Every frontier saw both, but in general, freedom won out in America, while servitude did so in Russia. Poland was strange in that the elite prided themselves greatly on freedom, but at the same time, they deeply oppressed their serf populations. Freedom-based frontier systems universally see much greater population growth and economic growth, since people have an incentive to work hard.
Also, I have to say something really interesting, because the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, as I often say, had the biggest Jewish community in the world. And this community had bigger growth than the Christian community. And this has the reason for that was that the Jewish community actually took care of its poorest members, unlike the Christians. So in the Jewish community, the poorest members had, even if they were very poor, they had housing, they had sort of healthcare provided by the community, and food. So they would not die of starvation or lack of housing. This is how the Jewish community in the Commonwealth, they didn't have guns. This is how the Jewish community in the Commonwealth took care of their own. And that led to less children dying in birth, and that led to a bigger growth in population among the Jewish people than the Christians.
Fully use their creativity. Ones based off servitude can maintain a higher level of development at an earlier stage with less people. The prime comparison here is America and Mexico, in which America surpasses Mexico by every metric, but Mexico started out 100 years earlier.
And of course, he is comparing a nation states to the composite state, that which was the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. Totally different things.
With a larger population and more advanced society. With farmers allowed to migrate to the cities and leave their lands, it would result in a rising of the cost of wage labor as the landlords would compete for tenants. In our timeline, The cities of Poland were small affairs. Gdansk, the largest city, had a population of 35,000.
And a lot of the cities in the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth were more populated by Jewish people than by Christians.
Well, the next
This is, among other things, why the Jewish people were not considered a minority within the Commonwealth, but just a separate sort of social class.
next few were around 15,000. The cities of Western Europe, like London, Paris, or Amsterdam, had populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Meanwhile, the populations of these cities were overwhelmingly German or Jewish, with the Poles being overwhelmingly rural. This wouldn't occur in this timeline, with Poles flooding into the cities to find work. Supporting a manufacturing.
Also keep in mind that the Polish people within the Commonwealth were just 40% of the whole population. 40%.
Economy. In our timeline, once the system was slightly reformed, Poland was one of the first countries to industrialize. Similarly, with higher population growth, the Poles would migrate further into the eastern regions like Ukraine, which was really lightly populated. I haven't mentioned these regions.
That's not exactly... They were getting populated by... they had the native, quote-unquote population of the Rus. So that's not exactly true. And once again, Polish people only made up 40% of the whole population of the Commonwealth.
Regions much, but this was actually the union of Poland and Lithuania. But Poland was really the one running the show.
No, it
Poles
wasn't.
would migrate into the fertile fields of Ukraine.
Like, this is a really big misreading of what was happening. That quote-unquote Poland was really running the show. That is not historically correct. Oh, science was pretty okay. Yeah, it was mentioned, but it's mentioned incorrectly. It's not quote-unquote Poland being in charge of things. This is like really incorrect.
Settling the land independent of rapacious Polish landlords, followed by birthing more children to continue the cycle. Frontier environments can birth enormous populations if given incentives, so we're more than doubling or possibly even tripling the number of Poles in this world. Lithuania had a different system. It was a separate monarchy from Ukraine and Poland, and thus not fully open to Polish immigration. It was already dominated by a powerful group of oligarchs who controlled the society, like the Radziwiłłs, and would thus have less incentive to Polish immigration. Lithuania would remain
This is not what happened. Okay, I will explain it because this person is talking... This person... I think so. This person is saying a lot of nonsense right now. Okay?
It was already dominated by a powerful group of...
By the way, Radziwiłłowie are like now... Radziwiłł is considered now a Polish surname, by the way.
Ukraine, with peasants settling... Similarly, with higher population growth...
We'll go through this once more because this is a lot of nonsense to unpack and I have to do it one by one.
The Poles would migrate further into the eastern regions like Ukraine, which was really lightly populated. I haven't mentioned these regions much, but...
Also, there were much more Jewish people than in just these two dots that he showed.
It was actually the union of Poland and Lithuania.
Yes.
Poland was really the one running the show.
And Poland was not running the show, it was a union, through and through.
Poles would migrate into the fertile fields of Ukraine, with peasants settling the land independent of rapacious Polish landlords, followed by birthing more children to continue the cycle. Frontier environments can birth enormous populations if given incentives, so we're more than doubling or possibly even tripling the number of Poles.
And also, this person is totally ignoring the wild fields were in constant... This was a big problem, because at that point the Ottoman Empire still existed and it kept attacking. So the wild fields were considered a place where it was most dangerous. It was like the Wild West times 10, okay? It's like it was unbelievably dangerous and unbelievably well, So people were sent there to fight against sort of also the Ottoman Empire. And so the Cossacks were born. the warrior people, Cossacks, you know. And then the Cossacks wanted to be equal with the nobles, the Szlachta, and they were refused by the Szlachta to become equal, so they did rebellions called the insurrections of the Cossacks. This is very important because that led to the Khmelnytsky insurrection, which led to a huge part of Ukraine being carved up from the Commonwealth, and it crippled the country basically. This is one of the main reasons why the Commonwealth stopped being a superpower and became for the grabs for the other countries. You know? I'm not sure, Moha. I'm not sure if this was known. But yeah, this person is ignoring many very important, things about the Union because he's focusing on it being just Poland. And of course, the Commonwealth of the two nations almost became the Commonwealth of the three nations. And this is where my explanation has to go in. As the Commonwealth of the two nations, the Kingdom of Poland and the Great Duchy of Lithuania will still fairly separate, even though they were united, So it wasn't that Lithuania was against the quote-unquote immigration of Polish people. It was just that they had their own administrations and their own kind of way of doing things. Those two big groups.
In this world. Lithuania had a different system. It was a separate monarchy from Ukraine and Poland, and thus...
And no, it was not a separate monarchy from Ukraine and Poland. Ukraine was not a monarchy, first of all, and there was no Ukraine, there was Rus. And second of all, the whole of Commonwealth was a mixed monarchy under the King of the Commonwealth. The king of the Commonwealth was at the same time the Prince of the Great Duchy of Lithuania. And the nobles from the Lithuanian part quickly assimilated with the Polish nobles because the Polish nobles had more rights and the Lithuanian nobles really liked that the Polish nobility had a lot of rights.
Thus not fully open to Polish immigration. It was already dominated by a powerful group of oligarchs who controlled the society, like the Radziwills, and would thus have less incentive to Polish immigration. Lithuania would remain relatively backwards compared to the rest of the Commonwealth.
That makes no sense, I'm sorry, that makes no sense.
Poles pulled off something very smart that few other societies can. Pluralism inside one country. The United States has done...
It wasn't pulled off by Poles, quote-unquote.
This very well, and that I can simultaneously be proud of being of German, British, and Irish descent, while being a proud Pennsylvanian and Canadian, and none of that makes me any less American, or some of my Indian or Chinese friends, even though they are born in different civilizations, can still become Americans.
Different civilizations? Oh my god.
Poland was similar, in which at least among the elite, one could be Catholic, Protestant, pagan, Orthodox, Muslim, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Tatar, Jewish, etc., and still not be any less Polish. In fact...
No! This is not how it worked at all. No. Okay, once again.
Tatar, Jewish, etc., and still not be any less Polish. In fact, It was the style to dress in Sarmatian or Turkic clothing among the Polish elite. In this time...
No, oh my gosh, no. Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth was not a nation state. There was no one Polish nation of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. That's true. I need to learn more about it, Moha. That's true, Moha. I feel humbled. But yes, there was no overarching Polish nation of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, okay? There was no such a thing. The Jewish people, the Czechs, the Jewish people, the Germans, the Lithuanians, they were not Polish. That makes no sense, okay? This is nonsense. Okay?
Less Polish.
This is nonsense. That was not a thing. What was a thing that instead of a national identity, the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth had a thing called stany. And stany is what we can translate into social class. So people could be a Lithuanian or from Poland and be a noble, or be from Rus, from Poland or from Lithuania and be a peasant, or a citizen of the city, or Jewish, which was its own class. There was no such thing as being Lithuanian but not being any less quote-unquote Polish. That was not a thing. It was the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, unlike the US, was not a nation state.
In fact, it was the style to dress in Sarmatian or Turkic clothing among the Polish elite. In this timeline, the Poles were able to successfully integrate the Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and various religious groups into a greater Polish identity.
No! This is nonsense! There was no such thing as a Polish identity! During the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that was the whole point. There was no such thing. I can see this dude's right-leaning going out now. I can see why this dude is right-leaning. There was no such thing as the Polish identity in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was not a thing because the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was not a nation state. This is horrible, but I expected it. I expected this take. So no one would assimilate into anything. Do you know why? Because the nobles actually made sure that this would not happen. It was enshrined into the law of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that the cultures and the way of life of the minorities would be protected. It was a very important part of protecting the laws of the nobility. It was a very interesting byproduct of the nobles looking after their own interests. There was no dominant culture. That's the point. It was a multicultural society. There was no such thing as like a dominant culture. The nobles made sure of it that all the minority groups could be within their culture and that could live by their culture, and and that no one would try to destroy it or sort of encroach upon it. This is exactly why the Jewish population could thrive so well within the Commonwealth. That's exactly the reason. No one would be assimilating anyone because no one wanted to assimilate anyone because there was no such thing as a national identity in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And if the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth never fell, then there would be no point in making it into a nation state from a composite state.
Whether or not this would be entirely willing is unclear, but for the peasantry of these areas, the Polish model would look fairly appealing.
What Polish model? What do you mean? Oh my. You can see that a far righter is doing this. You can see that like a right winger is creating this video that has no idea how everything worked before the 19th century when the nation states emerged. This is painful.
The Cossacks are fascinating. I always view them as pirates of the land. For those of you that don't know, the Cossacks were people fleeing the oppressive structures in Russia and Poland into the grasslands of Ukraine. They founded their own free buccaneer communities in southern Ukraine and were generally a menace to all their neighbors.
That's correct.
They were initially Polish allies, since a huge amount were ethnic Poles.
They were not Polish allies. They were not Polish allies. They considered themselves part of the Commonwealth and they considered themselves loyal to the king of the Commonwealth, not allies to. There were, but that came later, Moho. You are correct in saying this. But that came later.
Poles are Ukrainians.
You are correct,
The
Moho.
Polish desire to usurp them generally turned them against them. This never occurs in this timeline. With Poland as a free
No.
pluralistic system, the Cossacks remain their devoted allies. The best comparison to the Cossacks in this timeline is to the Scots-Irish in our timeline in America. In the 18th century, a large migration from Northern Ireland and southern Scotland to the Appalachian Mountains.
This is, of course, incorrect, because I will explain it after I destroy this enemy. Okay. So the thing is, that the Cossacks were not allies to Poland or the Polish people. They were allies to the king of the Commonwealth, and what the Cossacks wanted was to be equal to the nobility of the Commonwealth, and the nobility refused to give them that status. Okay? They treated them as peasants of the Commonwealth. This is the difference.
Took place. The Scots-Irish were rowdy and weren't particularly industrious farmers, but spread quickly and were excellent fighters. The American frontier was pushed forward by the Scots-Irish, who pushed all the way to California, acting as America's vanguard. The Cossacks would form a nearly identical role in this timeline as Poland.
Not exactly.
In this timeline, the combination of Polish farmers and Cossacks would take over the steppe, driving
Not
out the native
just
Turkic
Polish
tribes rather
farmers.
than the Russians. The Turks may have been excellent fighters, but they would be unable to stop the Polish demographic wave that would take Ukraine and drive into southern Russia. The Turks would be driven out of Crimea, and Moldova would turn from a Turkish vassal to a Polish one, which it was in the late Middle Ages. It's often forgotten, but the Poles fought a war with the Russians in the early 17th century and nearly won. The Poles had seized control of Moscow and had trounced the Russian armies. They became so overextended, however, that the Russians teamed up with the Swedes and defeated them. In this timeline, with eastern regions of the empire better populated, Polish supply lines aren't ridiculously overstretched in Moscow. They're able to seize and hold Moscow, turning the rest of northern Russia into
This is a
colonies.
very strange old history,
This region is
because
significantly less
the
fertile than
Cossacks would
steppe
not
of
allow
southern
it.
Russia, which the Poles
Okay.
would actively be settling. Russia is no longer a great
nonsense.
power, or even really a country in this time.
Like treating the
Russia was
Commonwealth,
pretty
as a common nation state is like nonsensical. You might as well be talking about a totally different country at this point. Like, it had nothing to do with the Commonwealth. Like, read a book about the Commonwealth. I know there is not a lot of literature about the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, but there are some good English language books about it.
weak at this
There are a
point,
few.
so could have been dismantled. Something to consider is that Poland in this era was in just as good a position to become the dominant Eastern European power as Russia. Poland was more developed by nearly every metric. Before Ivan the Terrible, Russia was barely a unified country, and before Peter the Great was barely even a
Because
part
it
of
was a
Europe.
duchy of Moscow.
Also, the Poles had a pretty long frontier with the steppe they could have used to expand their power,
Poles,
just
this
like
is
Russia
so
did in our
ridiculous.
timeline, going to the east. The Cossacks did much of the settling of Siberia in our timeline. The Cossacks, being Polish rather than Russian in this timeline, would push into Siberia. Much
Oh
of
my
Siberia
gosh,
was
the
painfully
Cossacks
easy
were
to
not
conquer, being
Polish.
so lightly
The
populated,
Polish, oh my
done
gosh.
mostly for the fur trade. Thus, a
No
skeleton force of
Russian,
Poles
what?
was able to do it.
The
this
Cossacks
did come
were
with limits, having
The Cossacks were not Russian! What? This is such a ridiculous claim! The Cossacks were not Russian!
capital in Warsaw or Krakow rather than Moscow would change the Polish Empire's priorities. The conquest of Siberia would take longer for one, since with the Turkish Khanate of Kazan
This is
blocking the way,
nonsensical,
and without
this
it being
history.
an immediate neighbor like it was in our timeline for the Russians, the Poles would be much more leisurely about
Like, to
defending
do
it.
all
Many
history,
of the harder
you need to
conquests the
understand
Russians did in
normal
Asia,
history.
like the Kazakh Tribes, the Caucasus, or Primorye from the Chinese, would never happen at all, with the Polish authority so much further away. In general,
oof.
before the railroad with the capital another 1,000 miles further west, there would be no way the Polish government could maintain power of the regions east of the Urals. Siberia would split off as an independent Cossack republic. However, in the long run, similar to the Anglosphere, there need be no bad blood between these two Polish-ish Slavic nations.
Polish?
Out of a base in
Wow.
Central Asia or Siberia, the Cossacks would continue to spread. Over time, the Siberian
Oh,
nation, due to its
oh, Queen, you missed so much. Oh, okay. Where do I begin, Queen? Oh, where do I even begin? So, I'll just start by saying, do you know this channel, Alt History? Okay, okay, okay. 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 Really bad channel from what I'm seeing. I don't know what your opinion about this channel is. I say it's really, really bad, okay? So first of all, he claims he treats the... I'm just gonna tell you the thing that was the silliest thing in the whole video. Are you ready? So he basically treats the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth as if it was like a nation
greater
state.
size.
He treats the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth as a nation state, and he says that if the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth would not quote unquote fall, then the Polish people would just assimilate everyone else into a single Polish national identity. To which I have to say, no, 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 that would not happen. Why would that happen? That would never happen because the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a composite state, first of all. There was no such thing as Polish national identity. And the nobles made sure that all the minority identities were protected. So this is like a ridiculous claim. And this is so bad to do an analysis of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth by treating it as if it was a nation state, which it definitely was not. Yeah, it was. And during this video, he said, yeah, technically speaking, it was a union with Lithuania, but Poland was just calling the shots, which was blatantly untrue. It was so untrue. This is like just ridiculous. Yeah, like ridiculous. Ridiculous stuff. Oh, Queen, you've missed so much memes. Yeah, Poland wasn't calling the shot because it wasn't Poland. It was a union. It was a union. Yeah, because there was a Szlachta, nobles, and they all basically created a one class that ruled the country. Yeah, that's right. But also, and this is very important, the country was not based on national identity. People did not identify as Polish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, etc. People identified as nobles, peasants, etc. Do you know what is the second stupidest thing that this person said? No, the United States is different. Yeah, they're closer to the UK. Do you know what this person said? This person said that no matter if you were Polish or Lithuanian or any other person or German in the Commonwealth, you were no less Polish. To which I say, this is nonsense. No, that's not how it worked at all. That whether you were Jewish, Lithuanian, or anything else, you were no less Polish. This is such nonsense. This is such historical falsehood. Of course they were not Polish. Like, I will say this one more. And if you know about the Commonwealth Queen, you will definitely agree with this, okay? There were people from Poland. They were people from Lithuania. Yeah, they were citizens from of the Commonwealth. And more importantly, they occupied their respective social classes of being either nobles, Jewish people, which were their own social class, peasants, or people of the cities. This was the, more or less the breakdown of society. People didn't care if they were Polish. People cared that they were a noble. That is the truth. The motto of the Commonwealth was, all of the land belongs to the nobles. And when the Cossacks demanded they have more rights, they demanded that they be nobles as well. This is why the Cossacks uprisings happened in the first place, because the nobles of the crown refused to give the Cossacks the status of nobles as well. This is why the conflict happened, you know? Like, reducing an interesting country like the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth to just being Poland is so reductive, is so bad that it makes me cringe. Yeah, Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth was a really cool country, and reducing it to just being Polish in Poland in charge of a bunch of territories so reductive that it makes me really sad that in the West so many people claim that that was the case. You know? And there are some good books in English about this topic. There definitely are. I'm actually reading one right now. I'm reading a translation to, I'm reading a translation to Polish, but my point stands. There are good books about the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth in English. Yeah, I know. I dislike this as well.
Especially with the invention of the railroad, would be able to become a
But I think that I heard that this YouTuber is right wing. So, of course, he's going to try to push the nation state narrative to the era when the nation state was not even a thing.
great power in its own right. The truth is that much of Siberia is pretty fertile, but the Russians were just never fecund enough to settle it. In sheer resources, whether oil, manganese, diamonds, iron ore, fertility of the soil, among other metrics, Russia is stunningly wealthy. If the Russian system was halfway honest, Russia, or in this timeline, Poland and its diaspora, would be stunningly...
Poland. This is so painful to watch, I'm sorry.
Poland's weakening was an awesome opportunity for Sweden in our timeline, who was nearly able to conquer it and create a world empire.
No, that's not... Oh my gosh, even that's untrue. Sweden, the so-called Swedish flood, was not aimed to conquer the Commonwealth and create a world empire. They simply wanted to replace the ruling Commonwealth king with their own king. Like, give me a break. Give me a break.
Keyword. On a different topic, for those of you who don't know, Germany was a series of tiny squabbling states for 600 years, and then was unified by Prussia. Prussia was able to form since the weakness of the Polish central monarchy allowed East Prussia to become a possession of the Duke of Brandenburg, and then, over time, for the Duke of Brandenburg to solidify power, become King of Prussia. This could never have occurred in this timeline. The Prussians, or the force that let Germany unify, would never have been able to pick up enough steam without a weak Poland. We sort of bemoan that Poland is stuck between two more powerful neighbors.
Like the fact that Prussia could not unify Germany without the Commonwealth, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth being partitioned is actually fairly true, because Prussia was fairly weak before the partitions. I think Prussia was, technically speaking, the one country that wanted the partitions to happen the most, And Russia was actually the country that wanted the partitions to happen the least. Yeah. Actually, the interesting thing is that Catherine II really did not want the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth to be divided. She did not want the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth to be partitioned for a very important reason. The Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth was at the time, in the 18th century, de facto under the rule of Russia as a whole. The whole of the Commonwealth was under the rule of Russia, and they had a pact that Russia guaranteed that the borders of the Commonwealth would be sort of like untouched, that nobody would encroach on the Commonwealth. But then the Commonwealth sort of screwed the pooch and led to the first division, the first, the first thing that happened, partition. This is more complicated because Prussia was divided into Eastern and Western Prussia. Eastern Prussia was, yes, the vassal of Poland, but Western Prussia was a bit of a different story, you see. You know? Yeah. Prussia actually wanted the partition of Poland because the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania because Prussia wanted the partition of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth because that would make Prussia not weak anymore. But yeah, Russia did not want this to happen.
We never think that those neighbors are only more powerful than Poland, since Poland let them get that way. With Moldova as a Polish vassal, the Poles would be continually encouraging the Romanians, relatives of the Moldovans, to rebel and join Moldova. The Poles would compete with the Austrians to dismantle the Turkish Balkans.
Also, I want to remind you once again, the demographics would not go the way this person is saying. The Polish people made up only 40% of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the Jewish people were a faster growing demographic than the Christians, and I already explained why. Did you know about this, Queen Charlie? That the Jewish people grew as a demographic faster than the Christian population? Do you know why? I'll let you try to explain and try to answer this question, and I will answer because the answer is actually fairly simple to this question. I already gave the answer once within this little response to the video. It's because the Jewish population took really good care of its population, of its members. The poorest people of the Jewish population were given housing, were given food, and were taken care of when it comes to medical care. So less children died in childbirth and less people died in general. So this led to the bigger growth within the Jewish population compared to the Christian population. The Jewish population did a far better job taking care of the Jewish people, especially the poorest ones. This is actually a pretty interesting thing that's described in the literature that is about the Jewish population within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I went to Polin to read about that stuff, to read in their library.
Germany might still unify
Pauline
this
is
timeline
the
due to industrialization, shortening
Jewish
travel
Museum
time,
of
and provoking
the
nationalism. But it would be a very
Museum
laid
of
back and lackluster manner.
Jewish
It
Polish
would likely be
history.
a loose confederation under Austrian leadership. This Germany wouldn't be very threatening, and that would be great for France, which was the greatest power in Europe beforehand. France and Poland would be the dominant continental European powers. The general trajectory of modern European history has been the growth and centralization of European powers. By the time Total War arrived, only the powers with the largest populations and industries were capable of surviving.
Of course.
The two largest diasporas,
Of course, the centralization was the opposite of the whole point of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth, if it survived, would have definitely not centralized because it was based on the never-lasting balance between the nobles and the king. You know, the whole idea was that if the nobles had too much power, it would lead to anarchy, and if the king had too much power, it was decentralized by nature exactly, because the core belief was that if the king had too much power, it would lead to tyranny. The king reigns but does not rule. Ever.
British in the form of the Americans and Dominions, and the Russians ended up dividing the European continent. With Poland effectively replacing Russia, the Poles would likely take a similar position as one of the greatest European or world powers. It goes without saying that Poland would be industrialized, and due to its size,
there would be no
an
Poland. Let's
industrialized
start with
superpower.
this. There would be no
As a
Poland.
democratic free power in the region with a burgeoning economy, Eastern Europe would be in a much better position in this timeline. Whatifalthist and
Do you know what this person also said that I was just dumbfounded by? This person said, and I quote, "The Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth had a booming capitalist economy." And I said, oh my gosh. The Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth never actually managed to even go towards capitalism. And this person said that the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth had a... Okay, so by capitalism, I basically mean that there was no profit motive within the Commonwealth structure, okay? When the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth noble... Yeah, I think it is. That they just had markets and sold things. And this is not the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth nobles did not have a profit motive. They just wanted to maintain their noble lifestyles. Yeah, literally. This is just
thank
ridiculous.
you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for more content. Or alternatively, check out my Patreon where I've got the first 3 chapters of my history of the world as well as all sorts of cool maps. Alternatively, check me out on Twitter.
Alternatively,
always,
get it? Because alt history. Get it? Alt history. Alternatively, okay? Get it? At least you would argue nobles wanted to keep their lifestyle as a profit motive. It really isn't though, is it? Because the profit motive, one of the big things about the profit motive is that you want profit for profit's sake. You always want more profit for profit's sake. That is the nature of capitalism, isn't it? You want to keep growing, keep the growth, right? And get more and more profit. And in this case, the noble, if they could just maintain their lifestyle, they would be satisfied. They would need no more. That is one of the biggest differences, right? They would not push for more. So that's like a big difference, isn't it? Okay, I will go to the toilet now. And when I return, I have been really recommended to watch a debate